Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 10 of the Listening Room Sonic Journeys. I'm your host, your groove guru, and your guide to the vibes, the cultural DJ. And this episode acts as a part 2 of a series I've been doing where we discuss Miles Davis and how his hiatus period albums between 1975 and 1981 have become part of the mainline canon of Miles Davis releases. Now, the previous episode, episode 9, was actually a different subject. I was still working on the notes and information for this episode, episode 10. So last episode was something different, but this episode is going to be the continuation of the three-part series. It's part 2, which I called the departure. The part 1 was regarding the lead up to the hiatus, and this part talks about the hiatus itself and the releases that come in between the hiatus period. If you're new, be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to check out the socials, the TikTok and the Instagram for Cultural DJ. Links for those will be found in the description. Be sure to also check out the accompanying playlist for this episode, which will also be in the description as well. So last episode, well, not a last episode, the part 1, I'm just going to say part 1. Part 1, I gave a bit of a mission statement for this series, and I'm going to go ahead and restate that now. So with this series, we're examining the albums released during Miles Davis's 5-year hiatus from music, 1975 to 1980, and how fans and critics alike have retrospectively deemed them as essential works for understanding Davis's growth and progression as an artist. So part 2, the departure. Now, by the mid-70s, Miles was greatly afflicted by a litany of ailments and maladies. He suffered from sickle cell, so that caused him a great deal of pain, namely a lot of hip pain. He also had problems like hernias and ulcers and different infections, most of which made it very, very difficult and very, very painful for him to tour and perform. And more often than not, these ailments were treated by a mixture of painkillers, alcohol, and drugs, namely cocaine. Nevertheless, he was touring relentlessly during this period, which only helped to add more pain and exhaustion to what he was already suffering from. And much of the touring was intercut with frequent hospital stays for pain and for his infections, which would only build his frustration over time. So as you can see, as we roll closer to the beginning of the hiatus, he was just under a lot of stress, a lot of pain, and doing what he felt was best to treat it, which, was really just a toxic cycle of drugs and alcohol and such. It was after appearing at the 1975 Newport Jazz Festival and Schaefer Music Festival that Miles would effectively drop out of music. He pretty much quit recording, quit performing, and quit touring. There was a combination of pressure, the pressure that was building from the innovation that he was working with during his electric period, and just a bunch of creative burnout. It was a mixture of that innovation, that pressure to be the innovator that he was, despite a lot of the negative reception from traditionalist and purist jazz critics, and then just the burnout from all of it. And after dropping out, he would essentially live a reclusive lifestyle in his New York City apartment. So some of the reaction to him leaving was a blend of curiosity and concern. People were wondering, of course, where Miles was. They were wondering if he was okay, if he was going to be putting out any more material or touring again. And some people went to the extreme of thinking that maybe he died or killed himself or something. There was a bunch of concern there that, maybe he'll never show his face again. Maybe he was completely done with music for good. So, this is one of jazz's greatest giants at the time. Despite any negative reception he was receiving, he was still the Miles Davis. So there was a lot of concern both from from critics and fans. Now, as far as the reclusiveness itself, it was just consistent binging on drugs and alcohol and women. These were his main vices. He rarely, if ever, left his New York City apartment, and he would be self-medicating all of the pain that he was suffering from with various substances. He even said himself that sex and drugs took the place music had occupied in my life. So you can see kind of how serious it was becoming. And then Tony Williams, his drummer, even said that by noon, Davis would be sick from previous night's intake. So anything that he had done the day prior, by the next day, the next afternoon, he was already just sick, So it really kind of shows how much his lifestyle at this point, for lack of a better term, was affecting him. That being said, of course, with the sickle cell anemia, his hips were deteriorating by a pretty gross margin, but he managed to get a much-needed hip replacement surgery in 1975, so this would help a little bit, but, he was still suffering from a bunch of other things that made it still painful just to live an average life. So, despite the hip replacement, he was still going through a lot, and he was still very much exhausted and burnt out and just in a great deal of pain from everything else he was dealing with. Now, before we get more into the more musical aspects, let's go over what was going on with his record label. So, his contract. Miles was under a contract with Columbia Records as far back as 1955, so about 2 decades in the making was this contract. However, by the mid-70s, Columbia was hesitant not only to renew his contract, but also hesitant to continue paying Miles his infamously large advance sums. Miles would regularly get these big advances on his records, and because Miles was not touring, was not performing, was not recording at this point, they were saying, well, I don't know, should we keep him? But it was they acquiesced finally after Miles's lawyer decided to shop around to other labels, namely United Artists. They were negotiating a new contract with United Artists, and Columbia would finally say, okay, well, this is Miles Davis we're talking about. This is one of the biggest artists in the country, probably around the world at this point, so, we can't afford to lose the Miles Davis. So what they did was they ended up creating the Miles Davis Fund in order to pay Miles regularly, despite the fact that Miles was not performing and touring and making new albums. So even though Miles was sitting at home, he was still getting paid, which sounds like a great gig, but given the circumstances, probably not as great as one would think, right? Now, one thing I failed to mention in the last episode that I will correct in this one is that Miles, throughout his Electric period, had a revolving lineup of different musicians, both between the studio recordings and the live recordings, and he would have some absolutely top-notch musicians. To name a few, he had Chick Corea, Herbie Hancock, Keith Jarrett, Joe Zawinul, Michael Henderson, Jack DeJohnette, Al Foster, Billy Cobham, James Mtume, Wayne Shorter, John McLaughlin, and Pete Cozy, and that's just to name a couple. And these musicians would act as an extension of Miles's experimental vision while also having creative agency, because a lot of these musicians were much younger than Miles, so they came with a different perspective that was very much based around the rock and funk realm, which of course Miles was heavily interested in by this point. So they brought in their own perspective and mixed it with Miles's vision. So this combination allowed for a variety of different rock and funk-based sounds in Miles's music during the Electric period. And many of these musicians would actually become influential band leaders in their own right and further progress the jazz fusion sound. Namely, like Herbie Hancock with his Headhunters, and John McLaughlin with the Mahavishnu Orchestra. They would go on and have their own bands and essentially build off of what they were doing with Miles, but add their own unique flair and their own unique sensibilities to that sound. Now let's finally get to the albums that were released during this period. The first ones we're going to be talking about, well, not the first ones, but the reason I'm putting these together is because they actually kind of act as sister albums, and those are Agharta and Pangea. Now, by 1973, Miles had formed a pretty stable live band, and they would tour relentlessly for about 2 years. And there were 2 albums that were recorded during a 3-week tour of Japan in 1975, both of which were held in the Festival Hall in Osaka. There was one afternoon show, which became Agharta, and then an evening show, which became Pangea. So firstly, Agharta, which was released in 1975, is a double live album that was heavily built around improvisation. Now, it wasn't just a bunch of freeform whatever. It was, for the most part, and this is kind of a theme that would stick during this period, is there would often be a musical idea, a figure, or a riff that they would essentially improvise around. So they would have this ongoing riff and then just build onto it and build and build and build, which allowed musicians to kind of do what it was they wanted to do or try different ideas, but still maintaining the same consistent riff, the same consistent groove. Now, on Agharta, you had Sonny Fortune on saxophone, Michael Henderson on bass, Pete Cozy on guitar, Al Foster on drums, and Reggie Lewis on rhythm guitar, and then James Mtume on percussion. So this was kind of his consistent, at this point, consistent live group, for the most part, right? And many of these musicians would stick around during a lot of these shows throughout the late 70s, and would return again, for the most part, on Pangea. Now, the tracks were really lengthy, right? You have tracks that go on for like 20 to 26 minutes a piece, but there was a great deal of instrumental interplay, interlocking time signatures, cross rhythm. So it was a very complex compositions, if you want to call them that, but very complex improvisations, right? And the music itself was heavily influenced by African music. Like most of the Electric Period albums, it was met with widespread critical panning, despite adoration from the live Osaka audience. Like the Japanese audience, they loved it. They thought it was fantastic, but of course, like most of the releases, the traditionalist jazz critics and a lot of the jazz purist fans were not feeling this project. They thought it was, it was blasphemous, just like many of his previous records. They said it was, sloppy, just a bunch of sloppy one-chord jams, disjointed sounds. The guitar was too loud. Like that's something Pete Cozy, who is a fantastic guitarist and has been compared to Jimi Hendrix, of all people, he got a great deal of negative criticism with his sound, and this was across multiple albums. But Pete Cozy, they were saying that Pete's playing was way too loud, way too wild, just really shrieky, and just cuts through the sound. And they said the same about Miles as well when he played his trumpet. He was using a wah pedal, right? So him and Pete Cozy and Reggie Lucas to a degree, were all just considered to be too loud. Their sounds, their instruments just cut through the sound like a knife. Some people said it was poor even by rock standards. So even though Agharta at this point is considered a classic, especially amongst Miles's live material, at that point it was really poorly received. Now, for these next recordings that came after Agharta, interestingly, they were released only in Japan. This is like the next couple of albums. The next one is Live at the Plugged Nickel, which was released in 1976, and it was actually recorded in late 1965, and because of, of course, this was predating the electric period. It was mostly bebop, with his second great quintet, which included Wayne Shorter, Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, and Tony Williams. So this was before this was before his electric period, and of course, mostly due to that, it was well received not only at the show itself, but also with critics that were saying, like, this is like the Miles Davis, I guess, that we know and love, not whatever he was doing with Agharta and Bitches Brew and stuff like that. But after Live at the Plug Nickel came Pangea, released also in 1976, and released, of course, only in Japan. This was released during recorded during the same tour as Agharta, maintaining pretty much the same personnel for the most part. Now, it's split into two tracks, or it's two tracks split into two parts across four sides, and each track is 20 plus minutes in length. So again, really, really long tracks and heavy funk and rock influence. A lot of what was said about Agharta can be said about Pangea. But one of the major criticisms of Pangea is that it sounded exhausted. It's probably mostly due to the fact that, because these two albums, Agharta and Pangea, were recorded in the same day, they had this really exhaustive performance with Agharta, and then they had to do the music for Pangea later on. So, one can only assume that by that point, the band was really, really tired. People said it was repetitive from the prior show. It was assumed that the musicians were kind of riffing and just repeating the same lines, essentially waiting for Miles to change up the sound or the song or whatever he wanted to do, take the song in whatever direction he wanted to. That was a major criticism of this album. Like a lot of his electric period material was really repetitive. After Pangea came Water Babies, which was actually a compilation. It was released in 1976, and it was a compilation album of material that was recorded in 1967 and 1968. Part of it was recorded during the Nefertiti sessions. They were outtakes, and then part of it was outtakes recorded between File di Kilimanjaro and In a Silent Way. Now, interestingly, with this album, some of the tracks would actually foreshadow his direction into jazz fusion that he would begin to dip his toes into on In a Silent Way, because of course In a Silent Way was really kind of the breaking point of his expansion into electrified jazz, we want to say. So these were like kind of the early experiments with electric instruments, because he had like Chick Corea and Herbie Hancock on electric keyboards. So even before In a Silent Way came out, he was already, of course, messing around with these sounds, which we actually talked about in part one, that even before In a Silent Way was recorded, there were some albums prior where he was kind of beginning to dip his toes into electric instruments, mostly with the keyboards. But we see that on Water Babies, he was doing it as far back as like 1967, 1968. After Water Babies comes 1977's Dark Magus, another live double album, which was released only in Japan, again, and it was actually recorded at the Carnegie Hall in early 1974, so this recording actually predates both Pangea and Agharta. Now, most of his personnel was, for the most part, the same, but he actually had Dave Liebman on saxophone. This album was thoroughly based around improvisation and sparsely rehearsed in order to test new members. In fact, he had actually added two new members, Azar Lawrence on tenor saxophone and Dominique Gaumont on guitar, and Davis would actually use this performance to audition these members. So it was definitely a trial by fire for Azar and Dominique. But this album has been noted for being much, much darker, more aggressive, and more abrasive in sound and atmosphere, which for me really encapsulates Davis's deteriorating mental and physical state at the time. But by this point, he was very much already suffering from a lot of his ailments, and it only just got progressively worse over time, which is what led him to temporarily retire the next year. But of course, I feel like a broken record at this point, but of course, it was poorly received by critics, like traditionalist jazz critics. In fact, this album was actually shelved by Columbia in the US. So many of these albums that were released in Japan only wouldn't be released until maybe like 2 decades after, in the 90s. So it was like these are all Japanese exclusives for nearly 20 years, right? But despite the fact that critics weren't really feeling it, Dark Magus would actually act as a major influence on 70s noise rock bands and 80s avant-garde funk bands, and would actually retrospectively be considered a proto-jungle album, as well as an early version, I guess, of punk jazz, because of its really aggressive nature. It's really kind of like punk adjacent, I guess, if you want to call sound. It's just really heavy. It's been considered one of the heaviest albums ever made, and it's a fan favorite for a lot of Miles fans. But it is certainly a challenging listen because it is arguably Miles's heaviest album to date. It's very chaotic. It's a lot of just musical mayhem, but at the same time, it was purely what Miles was shooting for at the time. And like the rest of these projects, it has become a part of Miles's mainline canon of albums. So after Dark Magus comes Circle in the Round, which was released in 1979 and is also a compilation. Now, this compilation spans 15 years of material that dates as far back as 1955, so well over 2 decades at that point, and is composed mostly of outtakes that chronologically move toward 1970. So from 1955 all the way to 1970, and features a wide variety of musicians that have worked with Davis across his career. And it was well received even by contemporary critics who praised Davis's scope across the decades. And really, the last track on it, which is Guinevere, is the only track that kind of delves more into the jazz fusion that he was going for at that point in time. After Circle in the Round comes Directions, which is actually our last album during the hiatus period, and it is also a compilation of outtakes, but this time being between the years 1960 and 1970. Now, like I said, this was the final album of the hiatus period before Miles would come out of retirement, out of his funk, for lack of a better word, and would begin releasing new studio material. And much like Circle in the Round, it features personnel from both before and during his electric period. And I see this album, this compilation, as a great view into Miles's progression from bebop and bebop's derivatives like, hard bop and third stream, to jazz rock and jazz fusion. This is probably and Directions is a great title, I think, for this compilation, because it's really one of the best glimpses at Miles's progression from before he started injecting electric instruments into his sound, and then to the point during. Now, it's not as far forward as the stuff you'd find on like Agharda and Pangea or Dark Magus, because it only goes to 1970. But even still, by 1970, he was already firmly in with the jazz rock and jazz fusion sound. So you can hear kind of how he slowly moves from bebop to jazz rock on Directions. So by 1980 and 1981, the hiatus was finally over. Now, despite Miles coming back to music, he had struggled to regain his embouchure after years of not playing. He really had to kind of work at regaining his ability to play the trumpet, which was, I can only assume, was extremely difficult. But, of course, he did come back in full force. Now, he was, of course, still afflicted by pain and even would go in for treatment for a leg infection a day after the very first session for his next album, The Man with the Horn. And The Man with the Horn is the first studio project he had put out in over about 5 years or so. And The Man with the Horn would be a stark contrast from pretty much everything he had done about a decade prior. He moved a bit more away from the heavy jazz rock and jazz fusion sound and went with a more pop influenced sound. This was the 80s, so he was getting influenced by a lot of the black pop acts at the time. And even he would kind of shrink his band a bit because he had like a bunch of like guitarists and percussionists and keyboardists, but he would shrink it down a bit and add new members. Bill Evans, not the keyboardist, but the younger saxophone player, and the great Marcus Miller on bass for this album. So the hiatus is over. We talked about the lead up to the hiatus. We talked about the period within the hiatus. And the next part 3, will be about why it is that the projects that we talked about during this part, the releases, the live albums and the compilations that we talked about during this part, have ended up becoming revered as essential listening and essential pieces, key pieces of Miles Davis's canonical album releases. So with all that being said, I will leave you all off with that. Thank you all so much for listening. I hope you all enjoyed. And if you did enjoy, be sure to like and subscribe. Be sure to check out the socials, the TikTok and the Instagram for Cultural DJ. The links for those will be found in the description. Also be sure to check out the accompanying playlists of songs for this episode, which will also be linked in the description as well. Thank you all again so much, and I will see you all next time. This is the Cultural DJ signing off.